November 1918, the Argun Forest in France. Morning fog envelops the shell-pocked earth as soldiers of 3 armies prepare for a battle that will go down in history as one of the strangest engagements of the Great War. Americans, French, and Germans all know that an armistice has already been agreed upon. Everyone understands. Every shot fired could be the last in this war, and yet they go on the offensive. This battle took place literally on the threshold of peace, when diplomats had already initialed the terms of a ceasefire. For the young American army, the Argun Forest became a bloody baptism, a place of national coming of age. The French saw in it the final chord of a long-standing tragedy on their native soil. German soldiers, fighting without hope of victory, defended the last remnants of national pride. But what is surprising? For Poland and Russia, countries not directly involved in this clash, the battle in the Argun Forest became a symbolic boundary separating the old world from the new. A moment when one era gave way to another. Autumn of 1918. 4 long years of trench warfare had exhausted the strength of all participants in the conflict. The Western Front, stretching from the coast of Belgium to the border with Switzerland, had turned into a landscape of nightmares. Cratered earth, barbed wire, and millions of dead. By this point, the scales were clearly tipped in favor of the Entente. The German Empire, deprived of resources due to the naval blockade, with a collapsing home front and revolutionary sentiments within the country, could no longer turn the tide of the war. The entry of the United States into the war in the spring of 1917 became the decisive factor. By the autumn of the following year, over 2 million American soldiers were on European soil, fresh, well-equipped, and full of determination. This radically changed the balance of power. The German High Command understood each day of war brought them closer to complete defeat. In headquarters on both sides of the front, information about an imminent armistice was already circulating. Diplomats were conducting intensive negotiations. On September 29, 1918, the German command admitted defeat and requested peace negotiations. But the paradox of war was that even at this moment, the fighting did not stop. On the contrary, it became even fiercer. In the trenches of the Argun Forest, the soldiers' moods were contradictory. The French, who had gone through the hell of Verdun and the Somme, felt relief at the approaching end of the slaughter, but also bitterness from millions of futile casualties. The Americans, most of whom were in combat for the first time, experienced a mixed feeling of fear and a desire to prove themselves before the war ended. German soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, clung to the last vestiges of military honor. Human psychology underwent a strange transformation during these days. Soldiers, accustomed for years to risking their lives daily, suddenly became especially cautious. No one wanted to die in the last days of the war, to become that very last senseless victim. In the diaries of participants in those events, there are often entries about how people counted the days, hours, minutes, until the presumed end of hostilities. The Allied command, despite the obvious approach of the armistice, insisted on continuing offensive operations. Marshal Foch, the supreme commander of the Entente forces, considered it necessary to exert maximum pressure on the enemy until the very last moment. This was to ensure the most favorable terms for the peace treaty. The German command, in turn, sought to maintain at least the appearance of an organized retreat, so as not to allow the complete defeat of the army. The Argun Forest is a dense massif stretching across northeastern France, in the Grand Est region. It is not merely a forest, but a true natural fortress with a hilly terrain, thick undergrowth, and winding ravines. In the autumn of 1918, this territory presented an apocalyptic landscape. Once majestic trees had turned into charred trunks. The ground was pockmarked with shell craters, and once clear streams were filled with mud and blood. The strategic importance of the Argun Forest can hardly be overstated. It was located on a key sector of the front, controlling access to the Meuse River Valley and vital transportation arteries of northeastern France. Whoever held these heights gained an advantage for further offensive operations. The nearby railway hub of Sedan was critically important for supplying German troops across the entire Western Front. For the German command, holding positions in the Argun Forest had not only military but also political significance. This territory served as the last serious defensive line before the German border. Losing control of the forest would mean an open road for Entente forces to the Rhine and German industrial centers. Therefore, even in the final days of the war, when surrender seemed inevitable, the Germans desperately clung to every meter of this land. For the Allies, taking the Argun Forest became a matter of principle. Marshal Foch insisted on maximum advancement before the armistice was signed. His logic was simple. The deeper the Entente forces penetrated enemy territory, the more favorable the terms of the post-war settlement would be. American General Pershing, commander of the U.S. Expeditionary Forces, saw this offensive as an opportunity to prove the combat effectiveness of his troops, whom many Europeans still considered inexperienced. The very nature of the terrain presented a particular difficulty. The Argun Forest was ideal for defensive operations. The Germans had transformed it into a true labyrinth of fortifications. Multi-layered trenches, concrete bunkers, camouflaged machine gun nests, minefields, and barbed wire entanglements. Every clearing, every ravine was pre-sighted by artillery. Attackers had to advance literally blindly under crossfire, unable to determine the location of enemy positions. Weather conditions only exacerbated the situation. Autumn rains turned forest paths into muddy torrents, making it impossible to move heavy equipment and artillery. Fog, often enveloping the forest in the mornings, hindered orientation and made air support impossible. Night frosts, followed by daytime mud, exhausted soldiers forced to spend hours in damp trenches. Despite the approaching armistice, the intensity of fighting in the Argun Forest only increased. Both sides understood the symbolic importance of this territory for future negotiations. Control over the forest by the time of the ceasefire determined not only the military outcome of the campaign, but also the psychological advantage at the peace conference. American troops entered the Argun Forest with the enthusiasm of novices, not yet having experienced the full horror of European warfare. For the young U.S. Army, this was its first large-scale operation in Europe since gaining independence. Soldiers, many of whom had never left their home states, found themselves thrown into the thick of a battle that became a symbolic turning point in the history of American military might. On September 26, 1918, the large-scale Meuse-Argonne offensive began. American units were assigned the most difficult task, breaking through the dense Argun Forest, which the Germans had turned into an impregnable fortress. The initial optimism quickly gave way to the shock of the reality of trench warfare. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, insisted on using American units specifically in this operation, rejecting proposals from the French command for mixed units. For him, it was fundamentally important to prove that the U.S. Army was capable of conducting large-scale combat operations independently. Pershing's soldiers encountered well-fortified enemy positions and their own inexperience. The Germans, occupying the heights, had an advantage in artillery and machine guns. Every meter of advance cost dozens of lives. American commanders, trained in open combat tactics, struggled to adapt to the realities of positional warfare. One of the most dramatic stories of the Argonne battle is connected with the fate of the Lost Battalion, a unit of the 354th Infantry Regiment commanded by Major Charles Whittlesey. Having advanced too deep into the forest, the battalion found itself cut off from the main forces and surrounded by Germans. For 6 days, from October 3rd to 8, the Americans held their defense without reinforcements, food, or medical supplies. Of the 554 men, just over 200 survived. This story instantly became a symbol of American resilience and determination. Newspapers across America published dramatic reports about the heroism of the soldiers. For a nation that had long adhered to an isolationist policy, these events marked a turning point in its self-awareness. American losses in the Argonne Forest were enormous. More than 26,000 killed and almost 95,000 wounded in 47 days of battle. For comparison, this is more than the U.S. lost in the entire Civil War. Such a price was a shock to American society. However, it was this battle that transformed the United States from a peripheral player in world politics into a key military power. President Woodrow Wilson, speaking to Congress after the war, emphasized, "America entered the family of nations not as an inexperienced novice, but as an equal partner who had proven its strength and determination." For American soldiers, many of whom were descendants of European immigrants, the battle in the Argonne Forest became a return to their roots. They fought on the land of their ancestors, defending the ideals of freedom and democracy, which they considered fundamental American values. For French soldiers, the Argonne Forest was not merely a dot on a map. It was their homeland, ravaged by 4 years of merciless war. Every meter of this territory was drenched in the blood of their countrymen. Every ruined house a reminder of the suffering of the civilian population. In the autumn of 1918, French units fought here with particular ferocity. They sensed that the final act of a long tragedy was drawing to a close. The French command, under the leadership of General Henri Gouraud, perfectly understood the symbolic significance of these last battles. The French Fourth Army, operating jointly with American forces, received orders to advance with maximum resolve. Gouraud, hero of the Marne and Verdun, a veteran with an empty right sleeve and a glass eye, insisted on the necessity of seeing the task through to the end. "One more effort, and this war will end where it must end. Not in the trenches of France, but on the aggressor's soil," he told his officers on the eve of the offensive. The French soldiers, exhausted by years of trench warfare, were in a contradictory state. On the one hand, they understood better than anyone the cost of each day of the protracted conflict. On the other, the awareness of impending peace evoked a natural desire to preserve themselves, not to become the last victim in this senseless slaughter. Sergeant Marcel Dupont, a machine gun squad leader, wrote in his diary on November 6th, "We know that peace is already knocking at the door. Every morning I wake up thinking, perhaps today is the last day of the war. And every evening I lie down hoping to live until tomorrow. A strange feeling, to be so close to the end and still see comrades die." French artillery played a decisive role in breaking through German fortifications. Experienced artillerymen, who had been through all the hell of war, provided precise fire support for the infantry. Their skill particularly contrasted with the inexperience of the American units, who were only just mastering the tactics of coordinated actions. After the war, the battle in the Argonne Forest held a special place in French historical memory. It was not just a military event, but a symbolic boundary between eras. For a nation that had lost almost 1.5 million people, these last days of fighting became the final chord of a national tragedy. Already in the 1920s, the first memorials began to appear in the Argun Forest. The French government decided to preserve part of the forest in the state in which the war had left it, with shell craters, remnants of trenches, and ruined bunkers. This place became a kind of open-air museum, a reminder of the price France paid for its freedom. For German soldiers in the Argun Forest, November 1918 became a time of deepest despair and the last manifestation of military honor. They fought, fully aware that the war was already lost. Every shot, every attack was not so much an attempt to change the outcome of the conflict as it was a striving to preserve dignity in defeat. Oberleutnant Ernst Junger, commanding a storm troop, wrote in his diary, "We know it's over, but a soldier fights not only for victory, he fights for his comrades, for his honor. Even when the flags fall, we must stand." The German units in the Argun Forest were a strange mix of veterans who had fought through the entire war and very young conscripts from the last mobilizations. Many of them were physically and morally exhausted. Supplies had virtually ceased. There was a shortage of food, medicine, ammunition. Rear services were collapsing before their eyes under the influence of the revolutionary sentiments gripping Germany. Despite this, German positions in the Argun Forest remained a formidable force. Over 4 years of war, they had transformed this sector of the front into an impregnable fortress with a multi-layered defense system. Every hill, every ravine had been turned into fortified points with machine gun nests and artillery positions. General Max von Gallwitz, commanding the Fifth Army, found himself facing an agonizing dilemma. On the one hand, he received intelligence about an imminent armistice and understood the futility of further resistance. On the other hand, orders from the High Command demanded holding positions at all costs. "I cannot give an order for senseless self-sacrifice, but neither can I order a retreat without direct instruction from above," he told his staff. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. The main forces were withdrawn to pre-prepared positions while rearguards of volunteers covered the retreat. These rearguard actions became some of the fiercest of the entire campaign. German machine gunners, often knowing they were going to certain death, remained in their positions until the last bullet. Artillerymen, after firing all their ammunition, destroyed their guns and tried to break through to their own lines. Feldwebel Wilhelm Klein, one of the few surviving participants of those events, recalled, "We had no illusions about the outcome of the war, but we wanted to leave the battlefield with our heads held high. It was not a question of victory, but of honor." Paradoxically, it was in these last battles that German soldiers displayed incredible resilience and courage. Perhaps the realization of the war's imminent end freed them from the fear of death. They no longer fought for the Kaiser or the fatherland, but for their comrades and their own dignity. After the war, the battle in the Argun Forest held a special place in German historical memory. Unlike many other battles of the First World War, it was not associated with defeat and humiliation. On the contrary, it became a symbol of a dignified end to the war, when even in a hopeless situation, soldiers remained true to duty and comradeship. The Battle of the Argun Forest began on November 1, 1918, when American units under the command of General Pershing launched a decisive offensive against German positions. The morning was foggy, which hampered troop coordination but provided some cover for the attackers. At 5:30 a.m., American artillery opened a massive fire on suspected enemy positions. Over 300 guns of various calibers bombarded the forest for 2 hours, creating a wall of fire in front of the advancing infantry. At 7:15 a.m., the first waves of American infantry went on the attack. The 28th and 77th Divisions advanced through dense undergrowth, encountering well-camouflaged machine gun nests. By noon, it became clear that the offensive was progressing slower than planned. German units under the command of Colonel Wilhelm Braun skillfully used the terrain, organizing ambushes and counterattacks on the flanks of the advancing troops. French units, operating on the Americans' left flank, faced even fiercer resistance. General Durand's 6th Infantry Division came under crossfire from Hill 123, which the Germans had turned into an impregnable bastion. By the evening of the first day of the offensive, the Allies had advanced only 2 to 3 kilometers, suffering significant losses. On November 2nd, the weather sharply deteriorated. Torrential rain turned forest paths into a muddy mess, making it impossible to bring up ammunition and evacuate the wounded. Despite this, the American command insisted on continuing the offensive. At 8 a.m., after a brief artillery preparation, units of the 32nd Division attacked a key section of the German defense, a fortified height known as Eagle's Nest. German machine gunners, sheltered in concrete pillboxes, met the attackers with a hail of fire. 3 successive waves of attackers were repelled with heavy losses. Only by evening, when French units carried out a flanking maneuver, were the Germans forced to abandon their positions. On November 3rd, the German command began regrouping its forces, withdrawing the most valuable units to pre-prepared positions deep in the forest. This created the illusion of a successful offensive for the Allies. American and French units advanced 5 to 6 kilometers, encountering virtually no resistance, but soon found themselves facing a new, even more powerful line of defense. On November 4 and 5, the fighting became particularly fierce. German units, realizing the inevitability of a general retreat, fought with desperate determination, striving to gain time for the evacuation of artillery and heavy equipment. The battle for the village of Champignol, which changed hands 4 times, was particularly bloody. By the end of November 5, the village was nothing but a pile of ruins, among which individual groups of soldiers continued to fight. On November 6th, the German command received information about the imminent signing of an armistice. General von Gallwitz gave the order for the gradual withdrawal of the main forces, leaving only rear guards in position to cover the retreat. The Allied command, also informed of the approaching armistice, nevertheless insisted on continuing the offensive. On November 7 and 8, the intensity of the fighting began to decrease. Both sides, knowing about the inevitable ceasefire, began to act more cautiously. Artillery bombardments became less frequent, infantry attacks less decisive. On November 9th, news arrived of the revolution in Germany and the abdication of the Kaiser. This finally undermined the morale of the German troops. Many units began to spontaneously abandon their positions, striving to return home as quickly as possible. On November 10, the day before the official armistice, isolated clashes were still continuing in the Argun Forest, but they already had the character of rearguard actions. Both sides understood that every new casualty at this moment became particularly meaningless. On the night of November 11, the last shots rang out in the northern part of the forest, where a small German detachment covered the retreat of the main forces. At 5 a.m. on November 11, the Compiègne armistice was signed. At 11 a.m. on the same day, silence fell across the entire Western Front. Behind every great historical event stand ordinary people. Their personal experiences, fears, and hopes rarely make it into official reports. Yet they constitute the true essence of war. In the diaries and letters of participants in the Battle of the Argun Forest, astonishing testimonies of humanity, displayed in the most inhumane circumstances, have been preserved. Lieutenant James Willis, a 24-year-old platoon commander from Ohio, wrote to his mother on November 4th. "Something strange happened yesterday. We captured a German dugout, and among the trophies was a photograph of a little girl. On the back was written, "To my daddy Hans, with love." I ordered it to be sent with a parliamentarian across the front line. War is war, but some things must remain sacred. Corporal François Dubois of the 6th French Division recalled an incident that occurred on November 6th. We found a severely wounded German officer in a shell crater. He was unconscious, bleeding profusely. Our field doctor spent 2 hours trying to save him. When the German regained consciousness and realized he was being operated on by Frenchmen, he whispered, "Why?" The doctor simply replied, "Because the war will soon be over, and we will all have to live on." Feldwebel Kurt Wagner, commander of a German machine gun crew, left a striking entry in his diary on November 8th. "Today the Americans attacked our sector. We could have mowed them all down. They were crossing an open field. But then I suddenly thought, why? A few more days and we'll all go home. I ordered them to shoot over their heads." The Americans seemed to understand our gesture. They lay down, fired a few shots in the air, and then retreated. No one died. Perhaps this is the first day of peace? Especially poignant is the story of Private Michael O'Brien of the 77th U.S. Division. On November 9th, he found a dying German soldier in an abandoned dugout. Despite the language barrier, O'Brien stayed with him until the end, holding his hand and showing him photographs of his family. Later, in a letter to his wife, he wrote, "I didn't know his name. I didn't understand his words. But at that moment, he was just a human being, just like me, who only wanted one thing, not to die alone." Sergeant Henri Lefebvre, a veteran of the French army who had seen Verdun and the Somme, recalled an unusual truce. On November 10th, the day before the official ceasefire, a strange silence settled over our sector. No shots, no artillery strikes. In the evening, I saw a German soldier emerge from the trench with a white flag. He offered to exchange cigarettes and bread. We met in no man's land, 4 Frenchmen and 4 Germans. We talked about homes, families, about returning to peaceful life soon. At dawn, we returned to our positions. Officially, the war continued for another day, but for us, it was already over. These stories, preserved in letters, diaries, and memoirs, reveal a remarkable paradox. It is precisely in the final days of war, when the senselessness of continued bloodshed becomes obvious to all, that people begin to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow war-weary soldiers dreaming of returning home. Paradoxically, the battle in the Argun Forest, in which neither Polish nor Russian troops participated, became a symbolic turning point for Eastern European historical memory. For Poland and Russia, this battle marked the end of the era of empires and the birth of a new world order that fundamentally changed the fate of these countries. For a resurgent Poland, which gained independence on November 11, 1918, the day the armistice of Compiègne was signed, the Argun Forest became a metaphor for the end of the Old World. Polish historian Stanislaw Kuczeba wrote, "When the last shots rang out in the Argun Forest, a new Europe was born, and in this Europe, Poland reappeared on the map as a sovereign state." Polish historiography views the battle as the final chord of the system that divided Poland among 3 empires: the collapse of Germany, the revolution in Russia, and the disintegration of Austria-Hungary. All these events, coinciding with the last days of the war, created a unique historical window of opportunity for Polish independence. In the interwar period, Polish school textbooks mentioned the Argun Forest as the battle that opened the door to freedom. Despite the lack of direct participation of Polish troops in this battle, it was perceived as part of the national history of liberation. For Russia, plunged into the chaos of the Civil War, news of the last battles on the Western Front arrived fragmentarily. However, the Bolshevik leadership closely followed the developments, understanding their significance for the world revolution. Lenin, in his speech on November 20, 1918, noted, "The end of the imperialist war opens a new era in the history of mankind, the era of the world proletarian revolution." In Soviet historiography, the Argun Forest was interpreted as the last gasp of the capitalist system in the face of the inevitable world revolution. This interpretation persisted until the 1980s, when a re-evaluation of dogmatic approaches to history began. Modern Russian historians see a more complex symbol in this battle. Professor Alexander Chubaryan of Moscow University writes, "The Argun Forest became a boundary not only between war and peace, but also between eras. It was a farewell to the world of the 19th century and the painful birth of the 20th century, with its new conflicts and contradictions." Polish and Russian archives preserve unique documents, letters and diaries of compatriots who, for various reasons, witnessed the last days of the war. Polish legionnaire Tadeusz Komorowski, serving as an observer at the French headquarters, wrote on November 10th, "A strange feeling, to see the old world dying. There is something ritualistic about these last battles, like a farewell salute to a departing era. And we, Poles, stand on the threshold of a new life." Russian officer Alexei Brusilov, who was in Paris at that time on a diplomatic mission, noted in his memoirs, "News of the battles in the Argun Forest came simultaneously with news of the revolution in Germany. We understood that the entire European order was collapsing before our eyes. And in this whirlpool of history, the fate of our long-suffering homeland was also being decided." What happens in the human soul when death breathes down your neck and salvation is already looming on the horizon? The final days of the Great War gave rise to a unique psychological phenomenon that military psychologists later termed Last Day Syndrome. Soldiers from all warring factions, upon learning of the approaching armistice, found themselves in a tormenting emotional trap between hope and despair. Private John Miller of the 101st American Division wrote in his diary on November 5th, "The scariest thing is knowing the war is about to end. Every minute you think, what if right now, with peace just days away, a stray bullet gets you? No one wants to be the last one to die in this war." This fear became a mass phenomenon. Commanders at all levels noted a sharp change in soldier behavior. Men who had shown miracles of bravery for years suddenly became extremely cautious. Officers complained about the impossibility of leading their men into attack. Artillerymen deliberately adjusted their fire to avoid enemy counterattacks. Military psychiatrist Edward Stricker, who worked with American units, noted a paradoxical phenomenon. When a soldier sees no end to the war, he can adapt to constant risk, accepting it as an inevitability. But when a specific end date for the nightmare appears, every day, every hour until that date becomes an unbearable trial. French Captain Henri Leblanc recalled, "My men, who had been through Verdun and the Somme, suddenly started discussing how best to reinforce their dugouts. Soldiers who had never shown superstition began wearing amulets and talismans. All conversations revolved around one thing: how to survive until the armistice." However, the psychology of the war's final days gave rise not only to fear, but also to astonishing examples of self-sacrifice. Junior Lieutenant Paul Schmidt, commander of a German machine gun crew, voluntarily offered to cover the retreat of his company on November 8th, knowing that his chances of survival were virtually nil. In a letter later found among his belongings, he wrote, "I know the war is lost. I know peace will come soon. but I cannot allow my comrades to die in vain in these last days. Better one than many. In American units, an unspoken rule emerged. Veterans voluntarily took on the most dangerous assignments, protecting young soldiers who had recently arrived at the front. "These guys need to see the world we defended," explained Sergeant William Harris, wounded 3 times during the war, his decision. This mixture of despair and hope, fear and self-sacrifice, created a unique atmosphere in the final days of the Argun battle. People simultaneously clung to life and were ready to give it for their comrades. The legacy of the Battle of the Argun Forest extends far beyond military history. Years after the last shots were fired, this battle transformed into a powerful symbol of reconciliation between former enemies. How did a place of bloody confrontation become the embodiment of peace? The history of this transformation begins in the 1920s, when the wounds of war were still fresh and mutual hatred had not subsided. The first memorial ceremonies were held separately. Americans, French, and Germans honored the memory of their fallen without interacting with each other. However, even then, the first signs of future reconciliation appeared. In 1922, French General Henri Gouraud, who commanded troops in the Argonne Forest, proposed an unusual initiative: to create at the battle site not just a monument to one side, but a memorial complex honoring all who died, regardless of nationality. His words, "The dead do not make war among themselves," became the motto of this project. The Meuse Argonne American Cemetery, established in 1922, became the largest burial site for American soldiers in Europe. More than 14,000 Americans who died in the final weeks of the war rest here. But what makes this place special is the French Chapel of Reconciliation, built nearby in 1932. Inside the chapel, engraved on marble slabs, are the names not only of American and French, but also German soldiers who fell in these forests. The German military cemetery Romagny-sous-Montfaucon, located nearby, remained abandoned for a long time. However, after World War II, when the process of reconciliation between former adversaries became a necessity for building a new Europe, this place was restored and transformed into a dignified memorial. A turning point was the joint ceremony of 1968, when French President Charles de Gaulle and West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer met on the border of the Argonne Forest. Their handshake at the spot where, 50 years earlier, their compatriots had killed each other became a symbolic act of reconciliation. De Gaulle uttered the famous words, "We remember the past but live for the future." The tradition of joint ceremonies strengthened in the 1970s and 1980s. Veterans of the battle, Americans, French, and Germans, began meeting annually on November 11th. These meetings of former enemies, many of whom may have shot at each other in the last days of the war, became a powerful symbol of humanity's capacity for forgiveness and reconciliation. Particularly moving was the meeting in 1988, when the last living participants of the battle, 90-year-old veterans, exchanged military relics, helmets, canteens, personal photographs. American veteran James Harris gave German veteran Otto Müller a locket he had found on the battlefield 70 years ago. To his astonishment, Müller recognized the locket of his fallen friend. "War divided us, but memory unites," Harris said then. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, the memorial complex in the Argonne Forest acquired new meaning as a symbol of a united Europe. In 1998, for the 80th anniversary of the end of World War I, the International Center for Peace and Reconciliation was opened. Representatives from all countries whose soldiers fought in these forests participated in its creation. The center not only preserves the memory of the fallen, but also conducts educational programs for young people from different countries and organizes international conferences on peace and conflict resolution. Today, the Argun Forest is not only a place of remembrance, but also a living symbol of how former enemies can become partners and friends. Every year, thousands of school children from France, Germany, and the USA come here to see the battle sites, visit the memorials, and realize the value of peace. For them, the history of the battle becomes not just a page in a textbook, but an emotional experience that shapes their attitude towards war and peace. Family stories played a special role in preserving and transforming the memory of the battle. Descendants of the participants, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of soldiers who fought on opposing sides of the front, established contact with each other, exchanging letters and photographs of their ancestors. Many of them became friends, some even became related. These personal connections between families of former adversaries became, perhaps, the strongest bridge of reconciliation. 100 years after those events, the Argun Forest remains not just a point on the map, but a living symbol of how the memory of tragedy can become a foundation for peace. The lessons of this battle extend far beyond military history, becoming a universal reminder of the value of human life and the possibility of reconciliation even after the fiercest conflicts. What makes the story of the Argun Forest particularly relevant for our time? First and foremost, it is a remarkable example of how the same event can be perceived differently by different nations, without becoming a source of new conflicts. Americans see in it a moment of national coming of age, the French a symbol of the end of suffering and the beginning of reconciliation, the Germans an example of a dignified conclusion to a tragic chapter in their history. For Poland and Russia, it is a boundary between eras, a turning point in world history. This multifaceted perception does not divide, but unites. It shows that historical memory should not be a battlefield of interpretations, but can become a space for dialogue and mutual understanding. In a world where historical narratives often become a tool for political struggle and the incitement of hatred, the Argun Forest offers an alternative model: respect for different perspectives and recognition of a common human tragedy. The second important lesson is the understanding of the senselessness of casualties in the final days of war. Soldiers who died in the Argun Forest mere hours before the armistice became a symbol of the absurdity of war itself. Their deaths force us to ponder the cost of political ambitions and military decisions made far from the front line. Modern conflicts, unfortunately, demonstrate that this lesson has not been fully learned. We still see ceasefire negotiations dragging on, parties striving to improve their positions before the final whistle, and human lives sacrificed for tactical considerations. The third lesson of the Argun Forest is the possibility of genuine reconciliation. The history of joint memorial ceremonies, where former enemies met, shows that even the deepest wounds can heal. This does not mean forgetting the past, but it means finding the strength to look a former adversary in the eye and see a human being, not a demonized image of an enemy. This lesson is especially important today, when the world is once again dividing into opposing blocs, and the language of hatred is becoming the norm of international communication. The Argun Forest reminds us, yesterday's enemies can become today's allies if they find the wisdom to overcome the traumas of the past. Finally, the story of the Argun Forest teaches us the value of individual humanity in inhumane circumstances. Those soldiers who, in the last days of the war, refused to shoot to kill, passed personal belongings across the front line, stayed with dying adversaries. They showed that even in the darkest circumstances, a person is capable of preserving their humanity. This lesson is particularly important in an era of information warfare and the dehumanization of the enemy. The story of the Argun Forest reminds us, behind any ideology, behind any flag, stand living people with their fears, hopes, and aspirations for happiness.